Hello everyone, welcome back to the CSFL Kickoff Show, and we have got a great lineup coming to you today. We're going to be talking through week 3 reactions, some teams that maybe at this point are staring down the barrel without a win, teams that are talking through great performances, as well as talking through general playbook analysis, strategy and tips, and of course our CSFL GM bites. It's going to be a fun show. Let's get straight to the action. Okay guys, you know the score. Let's get straight into it, looking at some of the week 3 action that has happened. And of course, we probably have to start with the biggest game of this week's sim, which was none other than the Tennessee Titans against the Denver Broncos. A really interesting early season matchup here between two teams who many think in the AFC are going to be competing probably for that title, and who knows, maybe for the eventual Super Bowl champion crown. The Broncos obviously led by Toasty, Titans led by our GM Josh, and well, it was a brutal matchup really. One of the games that basically at half time looked like it could go either way, with the Broncos just having that 4-point lead. However, when it came down to it, it looks like Nick Foles probably didn't quite have enough in the locker to get the job done for the Titans. The Broncos defense really turning up and being fairly effective in this one, in particular at stopping some of the crucial situations that are needed down the stretch really. If we look at across the board, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Nick Foles with his 37% throwing percentage was probably the deciding factor in this. I'm guessing that the Titans are probably going to be hoping that Winston is back in schedule soon for them to be able to make sure that they don't get any other losses like this. So interesting one here. I mean, probably didn't get quite a true reflection of how these guys might go head to head in a playoff situation, just because Foles did have to come in and play. But you know, a really good notch on the CSFL regular season schedule for the Broncos, getting the win in this one and giving them obviously a nice start to the season, going 3-0. Whereas the Titans are obviously up against it a little bit early on in this one, which is probably the first time they've had that in a little while, with the Jacksonville Jaguars getting the win over Kansas City here, and looking like they're in some really fairly strong form. I mean, despite the fact that Dak Prescott had a really terrible outing in terms of his 2 interceptions here, not really getting much going on the passing game, and the Chiefs actually putting up a really good fight in terms of their offensive output. It was that Chiefs defense that really did let them down in the end on this one. But it means the Jacksonville Jaguars are top of that division, and it means that the Titans are still behind for the first time in a fairly long while. But let's move on to a couple of teams that probably we haven't mentioned on the show for a little while, and have had some really good and really promising starts. Of course, we have to talk about 3-0 Minnesota Vikings. Last year, obviously, they started strongly as well, and the question mark that will be hanging over this Vikings team is whether they can keep the consistency going through the season. SANCHEZ has looked really effective early on this year, having putting up some pretty good numbers, one of his best ever QB ratings, some really good throwing percentages, and he's not necessarily throwing as many interceptions as he has done previously. So that's a big thing for them. I mean, they've got some really good options in terms of receiving. White is obviously still going strong, putting up some solid enough numbers for them already in this season, and looking like it's going to be a strong one for them. As I said though, the question is whether they can keep it up. But beating the Philadelphia Eagles, who we mentioned I believe on last week's episode, as a team that I expect to probably be in the playoff hunt, is a good performance for this Vikings team. And it really is that offensive efficiency that is driving them forward. I mean, if we look at some of their advanced stats, their yards gains per yards attempts is 1.5. Their offensive drop rating is just 5%, which is fantastic. It just shows that they are making plays and they are just efficient. They've been really efficient on that offensive end. Of course, they also have been one of the best disciplined teams in the league, with just 5.8% discipline rating, which means that they are not giving away silly penalties as much as some of the other teams are. And it's really starting to show through. And that Vikings team 3-0, have a really good shot if they can keep this consistency going. We also have to probably talk a little bit about a couple of teams that I thought would be in sort of that mid-pack, but have started to show some signs that they could could be fighting for the playoff spot a lot more closely than I had anticipated, certainly. And that is, of course, the Washington Commanders. TERRELLE PRYOR is one of these really interesting enigmas in the CSFL. He seems to have some really good games and some really bad games, but his throwing percentage is looking pretty good this year. His average yards are looking okay. Whilst he's still throwing those interceptions, his actual rushing stats are looking pretty good so far as well. So we know that PRYOR needs to be a two-way type of threat to be effective, but it means that the Commanders are actually looking fairly strong so far. And it's not also on the offensive side that the Washington Commanders have actually been effective. It's actually really, to be honest with you, on the defensive side that they have been in really good form this year. They've basically been averaging just 0.043 point attempts per yards yards gained on their defensive side, and they're looking really good shape. It's certainly helping that the fact that they've got guys like WAGNER who just continue to be excellent players in sort of the linebacking position for them, as well as some of the other players. In terms of Ward is looking fairly effective so far this year with 6 hurries already, a sack. Looks like they're putting up really good pressure on the opposition offense, and 2-1 coming out of that, competing with the Cowboys. It looks like for that division so far. Looking in good shape and beating a very solid Bears team in week 3. We should probably mention that as well. And then, of course, we've probably mentioned them several times now, but the Pittsburgh Steelers just continue to go from strength to strength. I mean, they got a really good win here against a surprising Bills side so far this year. I thought this Bills team would be struggling down the bottom, but they've had a resurgence in the past couple of weeks. Not necessarily in terms of the win-loss ratio, but in terms of just some of their performances have been much closer to the par than I thought they would be. But the Steelers basically have just been phenomenal on the offensive side. Their yards gained per yards gains per yards against is 1.4. Their average points is 13 per game. Whilst their interception rate is slightly higher than most, I would say in the sort of the top end, their discipline rating is phenomenal at 4.97%. As well as their offensive, effectiveness in terms of their O-line is only 5%, so they're not missing too many blocks as a team either. So we can talk about MCCOY and just how much of an impact he has had, and really looking like he's going to have one of his best ever performances in the CSFL at the age of 32 is phenomenal. But that receiving core is looking in really good shape as well. And we know Austin Collie, he's been around for a fairly long time in this league. He's looking like he's putting up his similar sort of good numbers. His first down percentage is one of the best it has been ever. So for the Steelers, that offense is driving them forward, and they are unbeaten, which a lot of people at the beginning of the season probably didn't anticipate that coming into week 3. So massive props to those 3 teams. I think they've had some really good starts this season and have some really positive things to grapple hold of as they continue through into week 4 and beyond. So that's some teams that have been performing fairly well. Let's talk a little bit about some of the teams that maybe are surprising that they haven't got a win on the board yet. Of course, we probably have to start this with the Carolina Panthers, who have had a tough schedule to begin with. It's fair to say, losing to the Rams in week 3 in a close game is certainly something not to be disheartened about. The Rams have also had a slow start to the season. But interestingly, the Panthers still have yet to get a win on the board. There's discussions, I believe, ongoing as to whether they completely retool and rebuild. But I think there's some positives to kind of take away from this. One is that Chase Daniel has not been as the drop off from his performance has not been as terrible as it probably looks on the face of it. The touchdown percentage and QB rating are not looking great. His throwing percentages are slightly down. But on the face of it, it's not looking too terrible for him. I mean, he still is showing signs that he can still be a very good starting quarterback in this league. I think the surprising thing from perspective of looking at this is that actually on the offensive side, the actual receiving numbers have not been too great for the Panthers really so far this season. They're their yards gained, versus yards against is 0.8, which is one of the league's worst at the moment. They are, of course, having a fairly difficult time of it in terms of their offensive drop rate is at 13%, which is middle of the pack, which is surprising given how effective that receiving core has been in the past. And is probably not necessarily helping. I mean, I think if we look at somebody like Robinson, his numbers are certainly down from where they have been previously. Question comes as to whether that is a quarterback situation or whether that's just because Allen Robinson's having a slow start to the season. His targets are fairly good. It's just the actual averages in terms of what he's gaining has not been too effective to date. Likewise, guys like OLSEN have been receiving some more targets than probably have done previously, and have been fairly effective. So I think there's a question as to whether the pieces are kind of not fitting at this moment in time for the Panthers, and it's maybe something that they'll have to have a little look at. Of course, it also does indicate that their general points against and general defensive averages are not too good at this moment in time. They may need to look at that, but I mean, they've had a couple of tough games. I mean, you look at the schedule of the Panthers. If we go and have a quick look at them here, they have played some of the teams that should be at the top of the various conferences at this moment in time. I mean, the Cardinals is probably the one that you'd talk about that they probably could have got the win there, but they have played the Lions and the Rams, two teams that in the NFC that should be competing in terms of playoff and contention for the CSFL title. But there's a couple of other teams that we should probably talk about, and one of them is probably the Houston Texans. I don't think many expected the Houston Texans to go 0-3 in their first 3 games. And, when you look at the schedule that they've had to play, again, they've had to play the Chargers, the Broncos and the Browns, all teams that are probably going to be in the playoff hunt this year. So, on the face of it, Texans may be looking at the record and thinking that they've had a pretty poor start, but they have, similar to Carolina, probably played 3 very, very good teams in this league. When you look at it, they've got similar yards gained and yards against as the Panthers at 0.8. Then offensive output is one of the league worst in terms of averaging just 14 points per game. There's some other things in terms of their offensive effectiveness, which is play by miss block rate is 18%, which is one of the league's worst. So there's probably some things that they'll need to fix in terms of that offensive line to get them to be more effective. If they can probably get a little bit more performance and help Andrew Luck out a little bit more, then they should be able to get away from this 0-3 record. And of course, I mean, another team that we should probably talk about, but it's probably more of an expected drop-off, is the Baltimore Ravens, a team that's pretty much held the AFC American, Division 4, or the AFC North, I believe it is, not the AFC American. What are you going on about? The AFC North had a stranglehold on that for many, many seasons, but a GM change and a transition is probably expected. Losing to the Titans, Bills and Dolphins, probably one that they would, in hindsight, have not anticipated losing. But the team looks like the direction of travel is changing. The Ravens are going into a full rebuild at 0-3. This is probably the turning point of the FLACCO era. I think this might be, if it's not, it could be one of his last seasons in the league maybe, but his percentages are all down. It's one of his worst ever starts to a season that we can remember. His percentages are low. Interception rate is up a lot higher than normal, as well as his QB rating being almost halved from previous seasons. So the Ravens are probably staring down the barrel of a lottery this year, I think, at this moment in time. And, given trades and transactions that will probably happen, this team is probably going to be reshuffled around a lot. So my early season expectations, the Ravens continuing on and being a playoff team, is probably not going to happen this year. But, as I said, GM change is always a huge part of anything in this league, not just about roster construction. It's always about strategy and GM transition, and the Ravens are kind of hitting that now. So I'm sure that their fans are going to be asking questions as to how quickly they can turn that around and get themselves back up to the top of the AFC North. So that brings us to a conclusion of some of the overview things in terms of interesting teams and things to point out at week 3. In terms of the results themselves, there's a couple of things that maybe are worth just standing out. I mean, the Packers have had a really good performance of late. It looks like Vaughan has sort of stepped in and taken the run there. But I have to say, I've been really impressed with Peterson's sort of comeback so far this season. His numbers are looking really, really strong, and rightly so. He is in competition for that offensive MVP at the moment at week 3. I mean, his yard numbers are probably going to be similar to some of his best season averages, and rightly so. He looks like he's having a fantastic season for the Packers. And then finally, let's just give a quick shout out to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who got their first win of the season in week 3. Still without Aaron Rodgers, and of course that is the big question mark hanging over this team as to whether they can contend, be a playoff team, or will be staring at lottery. But Boykin has put up some good numbers in those 3 games that he's played, and he's not going to want to go out that quarterback position without a fight. But the question I think for the Buccaneers is, how's this team going to look when Rodgers comes back in? If you basically replace Boykin with Rodgers, is that a big enough step up for this team to basically go from maybe a .500 team to being a contender? And we will certainly see in the coming weeks when Rodgers comes back as to whether that happens. And that brings a close to our week 3 overview. I'm always interested to hear what you guys think of the season so far. What are your big standouts for week 3? What are your expectations going into week 4? We'll obviously talk about these, the teams and performances every single week, and what are the things that are standing out for us. But as always, we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the coming weeks. And let's move on and talk a little bit about game strategy tips as we continue to evolve from formations, depth charts and playbooks into playbook analysis. Okay, so for today's episode and the portion of the sort of help, guide and tips section of the CSFL Kickoff Show, I thought it would be a good idea to continue on the trend of talking about game strategy, game planning and playbooks. And in particular, one of the things that has been mentioned on the server and in various messages to myself after the past couple of episodes has been to answer the question, how do you analyse a playbook, or how do you analyse whether a play is effective or not? And I thought I'd just take some moment on the show today to talk through how I go about doing this and how I would approach it if I was a new team, for example, trying to build a playbook and evaluate how I can get the best out of the various roster players that I have available. So you will see we are back with our test league here that we have running, and of course we are back with the Green Bay Packers. And there's a couple of ways I would approach this, and the first thing I would do is obviously in the strategy tab, where you can go and find your various custom playbooks that you design, is obviously have a look at the various playbooks you run and the stats that they generate for you. And this is a really good way of just getting a quick snapshot of maybe what plays are working effectively or not working effectively. Now, as you can see, there's a couple of things that are interesting here. You can kind of see the number of times a play's been called and what the average gain is, the touchdowns and the interceptions. So if we take, for example, this play here, which the Packers have been using in this test sim, which is a tight end in pass. They've only run it 16 times a season, so probably once a game or so. The average gain is about 7.25 yards, which is pretty effective. 1 touchdown, but 3 interceptions. So what does this tell me? It tells me that most of the time this play is fairly effective in getting some sort of decent yardage. However, it's a little bit prone to interception percentages and possibility of having a play intercepted. So it might be one that I might possibly not use in comparison to, say, for example, a RB post set here, which was run a similar amount of times, but the average gain was slightly higher, but the interception rate was a little bit less. So these are interesting things you can use to quickly analyse whether your plays are being effective or not, or being run effectively. Now, obviously, this is very much on an average basis. So it might be, for example, that if we look at this RB post play, we might have had one play here that ran for 80 yards and a bunch that have only run for maybe 1, 2, or even negative yardage, or not gained anything at all in terms of yardage, which means that when you average it out, it obviously looks fairly good on the surface, but when you delve into it, it may not be an effective play. So for example, a WR out play, which is obviously a balanced catching play. 13.67 yards looks amazing, and probably you might think, this looks like an amazing play, I want to run this a lot more and see how this works. And that may be the case, but the thing to remember, this is averages that we're looking at here. So you need to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But if you've got an average that's very, very low, that's demonstrating, so for example, this 4 wide receiver streak, it's run once a game more or less, the average gain is 2.65 yards. I probably do not want to run that anytime going forward. Whatever this roster looks like on Green Bay, probably is not effective for running that 4 wide receiver set. And so we're probably not going to want to run that too much. So that's one way you can approach this. And obviously, as I said, this is averages, so it's only looking at sort of the surface level of your data analysis in terms of your plays. There's a way you can kind of think about this and how to approach to see whether things are effective in certain situations or not. One way you could approach it is you could build a playbook for each different play calling situation, which I know some teams do, and they use that to analyse whether a play is particularly effective in a long situation, a medium situation, or a short situation. And you can have a playbook built up for each type of set. And if you don't overlap the plays that are used in those different various playbooks, then you will start to get a picture as to what is effective and what's not effective. However, that could mean that there may be plays that are effective across all different down situations because you have the personnel available to use it that you maybe not use in that situation. So if I was a beginner, first thing I would do personally is build a playbook with some plays I can see from the general play analysis of my head coach, for example, that seem to be effective, and put them together and basically build myself about 30 or so plays that seem to be fairly effective for the team that I'm running. Now, there's other things you can obviously consider. One thing is you could go back to basics and have a look at the roster you've got and see what type of players you have available. So if you have a really good, for example, receiving running back, you might want to give them more catching opportunities as well as running opportunities. For example, if you have 4 very good wide receivers, you might want to utilise them a little bit more, run some 4 wide receiver sets or 4 receiving option sets and use that. Likewise, you might have a really, really good receiving tight end, which you can see here. It looks like this Green Bay team does in Robert TONYAN, I think that is, who's really good hands, good speed. Looks like he's a very effective tight end. So you might want to use some tight end catching options to enable him to have more opportunity. So that's one way you could do it, is mix those two things together and you'll get a rough feel for what works and what doesn't work at sort of a top surface level. Now, as you start to develop this, and the question you'll immediately be asking yourself is, as I said, when you look at averages, you don't necessarily see the full picture. Now, one way you can look and basically analyse whether something is effective or not in more of a different type of situation is you can obviously look at various game by games that you run. So you can go in and look at the play analysis, which if it loads up, and you'll get an idea of situation, what balances you're kind of effective on roughly, and what your average gain is. And that could be hopefully determine whether you've got some ineffective plays in there for certain situations, or whether you've got, for example, you're waiting on your pass to run ratios and are not as effective on the offensive side. So something to bear in mind and have a look at that as well. But if you really want to go into the detail and you really want to see what situations are working most effectively for your team, the best way to do it, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's a little bit of work, is to go in and watch the actual games. So if I just quickly run this one, this is a Green Bay against Giants game, I think. I have no idea what the score was, but you'll see once we get through some of the plays here, you'll get an idea roughly. If you watch this game, play by play, you'll get a feeling in terms of what the we'll just slow this down a little bit and this animation speed down so we can kind of see what's going on. But obviously the 2D is not necessarily working because we've gone past this point. So maybe we'll just let's just sim the wildcard week and show the score, watch the game, and we'll run this one so we can actually see the 2D in effect. So what you'll see at the top here is you can see the play called. So you can quickly start to log what play situations you were up against and what set you ran and to see whether it's effective or not. And if you do this over the course of a season, you'll start to build up a picture of what's really effective for your team or not. So you can see here we're running a play action RB out, and it gained 5 yards against a 3-3-5 there. And you can start to just quickly map out against plays against formation types, average, the yardage you gained, whether it was a touchdown, interception, etc. And you can start to build that second layer of information, which is not just averages, but it's also against what type of formation sets you're playing against, which is really, really effective to look at. And it's one of the ways that some of the top teams in the CSFL look at their teams and look at their strategy, is they look at it at that level of detail. The other thing that you can do is you can obviously look at the play analysis of each game. So whilst you're not going into the detail of watching every single game, you can see here the type of play and what it was up against and what the average was. And you can get a flavour of roughly how that looks, both from a visual sense if you watch the games, but also from a data sense here. And you can see what the average game was and a number of times it was run. I would say watch the games and look at this data and build up that picture, because then you'll get a sense of whether a play is particularly high risk, high reward, in terms of, for example, this one play here, which was a fly play in a 2 tight end jumbo situation against the 5-2. It got 20 yards against the 5-2, but it looks like it was basically fairly ineffective against the 3-4 defense here. Averaging just 8 yards for 3 sets of plays there. So, averaging just nothing actually against the 3-4. That was a fullback fly there. So you can start to build up your picture of what plays are effective against what types of formation sets. And that's really, really useful information to kind of build up. And it does, as I said, it takes probably a season of that sort of general data to build up that picture of how your team is performing with the rotations you've got in your playbook against certain situations. And you can start to refine that and change the frequency of the types of plays you want to run based on what the formation sets that you're seeing. And once you've built that picture up, you can then start doing some of the detail against analysing other teams. So if we go back to the strategy tab, you will see here that on the play analysis tab, you can see against opponents, what the average things are that you've seen. But you can also go in and have a look at what the opposition you're up against has been running. And you can obviously do that fairly effectively here, or by looking at the game, the game you're up against. So for example, if we're playing let's see, just playing the Chicago Grizzlies in the next game, you can go in and look at the play analysis and see exactly what types of plays they run. And you can build up a picture of what their defense looks like here. So they're running a real mix of things actually, but also what they're running on offense. And you can start to build up that picture of how you might want to tweak your eventual playbook and game plan against your opposition. And once you've put all these things together, you'll start to really effectively game plan for every single opposition team you face. So, for example, in the CSFL, the Tennessee Titans might run a completely different set of strategies to, let's say, the Baltimore Ravens, for example. But you'll start to build up that picture, and you'll start to build up what you've got that's effective in your arsenal against those types of teams. And then you get into a real interesting layer of sort of general data analysis and general playbook design. But as I said, if I was starting from scratch and I just joined the league, just trying to build up this picture, as I've said on previous episodes, build your depth charts, go and look at the episode I did for that, build your formations for the previous episode, and then build your custom playbook, as we said last week, and just go through that and just start building up some of that data and that analysis that you'd want to build up that picture of what's working effective and not. And even if you don't go to the level I've just described, where you're looking at every single game and you're looking at your playbook against certain situations, even if you just go to here and you have a playbook and you start refining this and removing, for example, some of these plays like this where it's been run 10 times, it's 1.7 yards, remove some of those ineffective plays and build up the average, you'll start to build up a better type of playbook for your team anyway, and you'll quickly see how that can revolutionize your team and really put you on the front foot in any league, really. Now, the final thing I would say is, if you do want to go to the complete nth degree, you can of course build out playbooks and you can export them and you can run them in test leagues. Build a league quickly in the game, run it through several seasons, build up data that way, and you'll get an idea of what's effective and what's not. The only thing I would say to anyone doing that is make sure that you build a defensive playbook and make sure that is set up for the various teams in the league, so that you are running against what is a semi-human type playbook. Because as we all know, the AI in this game runs some very crazy decisions for playbooks, and when you get to any form of competitive multiplayer league, as soon as a GM and a coach notices that you're running an AI playbook, it's very easy to play against because of the way that it uses the 5-2 offense and uses some of the 3-4 stuff. It makes it you can put up city points basically if it's noticed. So you obviously don't want to build your offensive playbook against the computer defense, because you're going to be seeing things that probably are effective there that when you get to multiplayer are not effective. And likewise on the defensive side, make sure you have a mix of things and you are playing against a range of different offensive styles, so you can build that baseline. So similar thing for defense, I would say. Look at the average gains, the touchdowns, interceptions, and try and build yourself out a picture. Obviously it's the opposite way. So for example, this one here, this 4-3-0 omnibus, run 19 times, 8 yards on average. I'm probably, if I was running Green Bay, I probably would remove that from my playbook and not run that. Or for example, this 4-3 cover 4. But things like this LB Spies 3-4, I want to give that a go. And you can start to sort of refine this as you go along. But that's my main tips in terms of if you're trying to build a playbook and build the analysis around it. As always, happy to take questions if people have anything, and talk through this on the Discord server on the channel here. But hopefully that gives you just a little bit of a snippet of some of the basics you can do to kind of build a semi-competitive playbook in a fairly quick fashion of time, really. So that brings us to the close of sort of our guide and tips and analysis stage. But let's move on to, as you all know, we always end our shows with the CSFL GM Bite. And before we hear this week's one, let's go back and revisit last week's GM Bite and find out exactly what GM it is.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff Show.
Okay, did you manage to guess last week's CSFL GM Bite? It was, of course, none other than one of our new GMs in the CSFL, the Seattle Seahawks, Birdman. Birdman, thank you very much for taking the time to give us that CSFL GM Bite. But, of course, let's move on and find out who this week's one is.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff Show.
And there you go, guys. That is this week's CSFL GM Bite. As always, you can put your guesses into the Discord server or here on the channel, and we'll be back next week to find out exactly who it is. And that does draw us to a conclusion for this week's show. It's been great looking at week 3, seeing some teams starting to pull away from the pack, others looking at how they can get around and get those wins on the board, continue to develop their playbook strategies, their team, their rosters, everything that is still going on. And of course, we'll be back next time to talk a little bit about tips, strategy and guides. But until then, have a great weekend.